We're breaking down how a closed economy fights short-term unemployment using two very different rescue strategies, and why the strategy you pick completely changes the outcome for private businesses. Now, you're probably wondering, if the economy is totally stalled out, does it actually matter who steps in to fix it, the government or the central bank? Well, we need to look at our first option, which is government action. First, we have fiscal expansion. When the government ramps up spending or cuts taxes, aggregate demand shifts right. Output grows and prices rise. But those higher prices shrink real money balances, which forces interest rates to spike. It's kind of like the government stepping on the gas pedal. Sure, the engine revs up, but that inflation acts like a brake on private businesses trying to get a loan. Because borrowing gets so expensive, private investment actually decreases. So if government spending chokes out private investment, what's our alternative? Second, let's look at monetary expansion. If the central bank lowers the reserve ratio or buys bonds, they increase the money supply. Why does this work better for businesses? Well, flooding the system with liquidity pushes interest rates down, making cash super cheap to borrow. Aggregate demand still shifts right, output grows, and prices rise. But crucially, investments absolutely increase. Finally, let's look at the bottom line. Both of these expansions successfully raise output to fight short-run unemployment, but they have totally opposite effects on investment. Fiscal expansion shrinks it, while monetary expansion grows it. To cure an unemployment slump, both government spending and money printing will get the economy moving again, but only the central bank's method leaves private businesses with the cheap money they need to actually grow.
This is the brief on the ADS macroeconomic model. It's the ultimate cheat sheet for how an economy balances out by tracking two variables: overall price levels and total economic output, or GDP. Ever wonder why inflation and economic growth always seem so tangled up together? First, let's look at aggregate demand, or AD. It's the sum of consumer, business, and government spending. It triggers a wild chain reaction. When prices go up, real money supply shrinks, making interest rates rise. That makes borrowing expensive, dropping overall output. It's kind of like a financial seesaw. As prices weigh down one side, business investment and total output get pushed down on the other. Second, we have aggregate supply, or AS. It acts totally differently over time. In the short run, wages are sticky, so higher prices tempt producers to manufacture more. Wait, if prices go up, can we just trick the economy into producing more forever? Nope. The long-run supply curve is completely vertical. Long-term output relies on real-world limits like capital, labor, and technology. Price changes do nothing to it. It's a hard reality check. Finally, know the difference between a movement and a shift. Changing prices just causes a movement along existing curves. But changing real factors, like the government spending more or a massive tech breakthrough, actually shifts the entire curve. Shifting these curves is exactly how central banks steer us out of recessions. Ultimately, the ADS model proves the link between prices and economic output isn't random chaos. It's a highly predictable chain reaction driven by short-term interest rates and the long-term hard limits of labor and technology.
Today, we're focusing strictly on the money market, and I mean absolutely nothing else, setting the stage to understand exactly how price levels dictate the reality of our money and our borrowing costs. First, let's talk about the initial trigger, where an increase in P, the overall price level, directly leads to a decrease in the real money supply. Think about it like this. If the price of your daily iced coffee suddenly doubles, well, that $10 bill in your wallet hasn't physically changed at all, but its real value and actual purchasing power in the market has essentially shrunk. Second, we have to look at the domino effect, because this drop in the real money supply leads to a direct increase in the interest rate within the economy. So if there is effectively less real money available to go around, what happens when people still need to borrow it? Naturally, the cost to borrow that money, the interest rate, has to go up. Ultimately, when general prices rise, the real value of the money supply shrinks, which inevitably makes money more expensive to borrow and drives up interest rates. Today, we're diving into a super specific, no-fluff directive that demands an explanation of a complex macroeconomic concept, but with some extremely rigid boundaries. First, the source isolates just one single economic concept, the aggregate supply curve. It's honestly so refreshing to just strip away all the usual economic noise and focus purely on the supply side for a change. So, once we've isolated this curve, we have to look at the two specific ways the source actually asks us to view it. Second, the text specifically demands a contrast between SRAS, or short-run aggregate supply, and LRAS, the long-run aggregate supply. To put that into perspective, think of the economy kind of like a runner. SRAS is like a sprinter's immediate short-term burst of speed, right? While LRAS, well, that's their ultimate sustainable marathon pace. Now, moving from those core economic concepts, we really have to look at the strict parameters the source places on exactly how they should be discussed. Finally, the real defining feature of this text is its strict negative constraint, literally instructing us to explain it without expanding beyond that. Now, you might be wondering why put such a hard fence around a topic? Well, because in really complex subjects, deliberately blocking out extra information is absolutely the best way to ensure total comprehension of those core facts. Ultimately, this source is a laser-focused demand for a strict, zero-fluff comparison between short-run and long-run aggregate supply.
Today, we're using the Aggregate Demand Aggregate Supply model, or ADAS for short, as a fun little cheat code to figure out exactly why everyday stuff keeps getting so expensive, totally saving you from slogging through a dense textbook. First, when aggregate demand outpaces full employment, prices absolutely skyrocket. You can think of full employment as the economy's absolute max capacity, where factories are completely maxed out and everyone who can work is literally working. So imagine a highly anticipated, totally sold-out concert. When buyer demand wildly exceeds the venue's physical capacity, printing more tickets doesn't magically create more seats, right? It just kicks off a massive bidding war. Second, this crazy bidding war happens even when prices are considered rigid. Rigid prices are usually locked into long-term contracts, or they're just super slow to change, kind of like printed restaurant menus. But man, it really makes you wonder, if these prices are fundamentally built to stay put, just how incredibly overwhelming does that excess demand have to be to shatter those contracts and force prices up anyway? Finally, we're left with a real economic cliffhanger. We know overwhelming demand clearly creates inflation, but here's the catch. We've only solved the demand side of the whole puzzle. If demand isn't the sole culprit, what else is secretly driving up your grocery bill? Ultimately, the ADAS model proves that whenever demand outpaces an economy's maximum capacity, prices inevitably rise, but it leaves us eagerly hunting for the other hidden drivers of inflation. The ADAS, that's Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply model, is a massive economic concept, but today we're cutting out all that extra noise to focus strictly on the demand side, giving you a clear look at what truly fuels an economy. First, we isolate the aggregate demand, or AD, curve. Think of the entire economy as just a giant marketplace. Well, in this scenario, the AD curve is essentially the master shopping list. So why focus just on this curve? Because you simply cannot understand the broader market without first grasping the total demand. Second, let's look at the composition of that demand. It's not just a single solid block. It's actively composed of distinct smaller components like everyday consumer spending, business investments, and government purchases. So why does it matter that it's broken down into smaller parts? Because you literally can't comprehend the total demand without looking at the specific ingredients that build the whole shebang. Finally, we really have to emphasize the drivers of each component. Just identifying the pieces isn't enough. If we don't zero in on the underlying forces moving each individual piece, like how a sudden drop in interest rates motivates a business to build a new factory, we have absolutely no way to predict how the overall AD curve is going to shift. Ultimately, understanding the demand side means breaking the aggregate demand curve down into its core components and figuring out the unique forces driving every single one of them. Once you know exactly what motivates those individual pieces, you hold the absolute key to understanding how the entire economic engine shifts gears. We're looking at the mechanics of an economic recession, specifically when prices are rigid or sticky. So imagine a giant retail store where customer foot traffic suddenly plummets, but the manager absolutely refuses to lower the price tags, creating a standoff that directly impacts jobs. So how does this actually play out? Well, first, aggregate demand shrinks. Think of this as total spending in the economy just dropping off a cliff, which causes the AD curve to shift to the left. Second, the economy actually finds a new balance, or equilibrium, but honestly, it's a massive downgrade. It's essentially stabilizing at a completely broken level, just settling for an underperformance that sits way below its healthy full employment capacity. Finally, because production has dropped so far below that full capacity, unemployment naturally grows. But that leaves us with a pretty huge lingering question. What actually drives this initial drop in demand for output in the very first place? Ultimately, when total demand drops and prices stay rigidly stuck, the economy's output shrinks and unemployment rises, leaving us to hunt for the exact trigger behind that initial spending freeze.
Let's say the economy is in a recession with high unemployment. How does the government fix it? By using fiscal expansion. Let's see this in the ADAS model. Here's the ADAS model. The economy is currently producing below its potential output. That gap between actual output and potential output is called the recessionary gap. It means high unemployment and underused resources. The government steps in by spending more or cutting taxes. This injects money into the economy, boosting total demand. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the right from AD to AD2. As a result, businesses hire more workers to meet the new demand. Real GDP increases from Y1 toward potential output Y2, and unemployment falls. But because demand is higher, the price level also rises slightly, causing some inflation. So what's the final result? Real GDP goes up, unemployment falls, and the price level rises slightly. The recessionary gap is closed, and the economy returns to its potential output. Fiscal expansion works with just a small trade-off of higher prices.